director of these studies, he used the British civil service system as the subject group, and they found that there is a gradient of health quality in industrialized societies, which is not simply a matter of poor health for the disadvantaged and good health for everyone else. Something else was happening. Remember, this is the UK, which has socialized healthcare. So everyone essentially has equal access to the same amount of healthcare. They found, regardless of this, that there was a social distribution of disease as you went from the top of the socioeconomic ladder to the bottom. And the types of diseases that people would get would change on average. For example, the lowest rungs of the hierarchy had a 4-fold increase of heart disease-based mortality compared to the highest rungs. And this pattern was, to a certain degree, again, irrespective of access to healthcare. This is just one example, by the way. It's a gradient of health problems that emerge that cannot be explained by absolute income. And it, in fact, goes back to the stress response if you go into it and research these points. Even in a country with universal health care, the worse a person's financial status and position in the hierarchy, the worse their health is going to be on average. In other words, people in higher socioeconomic positions, those higher in the pyramid, live longer, enjoy better health, and suffer less from disability, while those of lower socioeconomic status die younger and suffer the greater burden of disability and disease. This comes in the form, again, of a gradient, meaning that from the higher upper class straight down to the lower class, bottom class, each successive step down or up the socioeconomic ladder constitutes a respective quality change in a person's health. The bottom line is that there's a great deal of statistical data that screams that living in a more equal society is more healthy and productive for about 99.9% of the population. It is only those at the very tip of the pyramid that could be considered unaffected by the disease known as social inequality. Equality benefits everyone, in other words. Now, given this reality, it begs the question, what is the actual psychosocial cause of these issues? What are the most dominant mechanisms in place that continually support class division and the neuroses and sickness it generates? Well, we really don't have to look very far for a viable possibility. The cultural programming wing of the market system is the advertising industry, which serves to perpetuate the consumption values that you see around you. However, it goes much deeper than that. It goes much deeper than just getting people to buy things for a specific company's profit. The fact is, the values of materialism and consumption are of dire importance to the operation of the world economy. Without those values, the system would falter, and let me explain why. At the core of the economy as we know it lies the unalterable requirement for constant, perpetual, cyclical consumption. In other words, the entire basis of what we refer to as economic growth, which in turn is translated into things such as gross domestic product, which are supposed to be measures of social progress and the like, is nothing more than human beings constantly and perpetually buying and selling over and over and over again. If human beings do not buy things, companies and stores cannot afford to pay their employees. If an employee cannot be paid, then that employee, which is also the consumer, cannot go out and spend the money they receive from employment back into the system to perpetuate the cycle. If people do not constantly spend their money, the entire economic structure, including the entire labor system, would completely collapse. Given this reality, the highest priority of any corporation, or in fact, any government that cares about its economy, is to make sure the public has an immediate interest to constantly consume. It is interesting to point out that America was originally founded on a certain degree of a Protestant work ethic, a Protestant worldview, where thrift and savings were actually dominant values back then. Since that time, advertising agencies had to switch their arguments from utility-oriented angles to those engaged in for emotional appeal and status enhancement. Americans now consume twice as much as they did before the end of World War II. As an historical note, One of the leading figures in this American value hijacking, as I would call it, is a man named Edward Bernays. Bernays is most famous for his book called Propaganda, in which it was bought by many people, including Joseph Goebbels. He was hired by all the major corporations many, many decades ago to help influence the public into buying things very simply that they did not need. A new world of neurotic associations, such as materialism and conspicuous consumption, to quote Thorsten Veblen, was unleashed during this time and has grown and mutated dramatically. Today, human needs have become utterly perverted by the imposed, suggested wants generated by the consumption-provoking mechanism of marketing and advertising. The more dissatisfied and unhappy a population is, the better it is for advertising agencies and corporations. Consumerism feeds on a form of inferiority and self-consciousness. And that translates very literally into identity and social status. Amazingly, the indoctrination is so powerful that consumerism is regarded by most of society as reflecting some kind of basic human interest, as though it's a reflection of human nature. This, of course, is baseless. In fact, our neurotic need to shop and consume is actually a reflection of how deeply social we are and how influenced we are by the social programming and status orientation of possessions and appearances and everything else that's been pushed upon us. Okay, on this note, I'm now going to begin to transition the next section of this presentation. And to bridge that, I want to make a point that not only does the status-generated consumption patterns of most of the public, especially in America, cause a great deal of social stress, leading in part to many of the problems we have just analyzed, the propensity for constant cyclical consumption, which again is required for the entire world economy to function, is also outlining trends which show a clear path to severe environmental problems and the continual breakdown of civilization as we know it, as we destroy all of our natural resources through this idiotic act of conspicuous consumption to fuel GDP. Part 2, prognosis. The prior points made about the well-being and quality of life issues associated with social imbalance is a big issue. However, to be fair, just because there's a propensity for an overweight, violent, diseased, mentally disturbed, selfish, untrusting, illiterate population does not necessarily translate into the consequence of social collapse, as we're beginning to see. So we're going to move on, putting the basic well-being of humanity aside for a moment and focus on the mechanisms of the social system itself and the larger order problems that are being generated. Okay, here's the deal. One of the most critical things to understand, without a shadow of a doubt, proves the unsustainable nature of our current social system and how it is on a collision course with nature, is this. Due to the way money and hence the market system functions, we are locked into an incompatible paradigm where two mutually exclusive operating principles, one, the need for constant consumption or infinite growth, collides with an unyielding finite planet and hence the physical laws of nature. You simply cannot have an infinite growth of commerce and hence consumption in a closed system such as the planet Earth. For all those that don't fully understand this, let me explain more. The planet Earth is basically a closed system when it comes to its resources. All the minerals and energy deposits that we currently use have rates of cultivation that dramatically exceed the lifespan of the human being. For example, oil and fossil fuels in general took over 100 million years easy for them to come about. The same goes for our mineral resources. The 4,400 mineral species out there today took outrageous amounts of time to be created. The diamonds that we find today took over 3 billion years to be created. Now, given this environmental reality, it would seem painfully obvious that the most important aspect of any earthly society would be the preservation of the Earth's resources, right? It would seem, in fact, that the entire basis of any economic structure would have as the number one priority the preservation of the resources of the planet. Why? Because once it's gone, it's gone. For example, even at this stage of scientific inquiry, we cannot take a tire, which contains probably 6 or 7 gallons of oil, and convert it back into combustible fuel. So instead of having a logical system of resource management where we actually monitor the Earth's resources and try, as the human species, to strategically orient our use of these precious finite elements, we came up with something much more interesting. And it's called the infinite growth economic paradigm. In our current system, we grab as many resources as we can, we throw them into anything that we think someone will buy, and we try to manipulate each other into buying these things from us for profit. In fact, the entire basis of the free market ideology is using and exchanging as many resources as possible, as fast as possible, to generate as much money as possible, which in turn is used to exploit more resources over and over again.